The rain came down hard over Springfield, Illinois, on the evening of October 12, 1967. Streetlights glowed faintly through the mist, and the pavement reflected their dim orange glow. At the edge of the quiet town, the doors of the Springfield Public Library closed for the night. Among the last to leave was 22-year-old Margaret Maggie Holloway, a young woman carrying a stack of books close to her chest. She stepped into the cold wind with her umbrella raised, heading toward the bus stop that would take her home. It was just after 9 o'clock when Maggie was last seen alive. A librarian recalled watching her cross the street, her umbrella tilting against the gusts of rain. She appeared calm, in no hurry, and unaware that someone was watching her. Witnesses later described a dark sedan idling near the corner, its headlights dimmed, the driver barely visible through the glass. Minutes later, everything changed. At 9:20 p.m., a neighbor named Clara Jensen heard a piercing scream from outside her apartment window. She leaned out into the rain but saw only the deserted street, the sound already swallowed by the storm. When Clara later learned that a young woman had vanished that same night, she would never forget the echo of that cry. By 9:30 p.m., the bus pulled into the stop. Maggie was nowhere to be found. What remained was a chilling scene. Her umbrella lay broken near the bench, twisted metal against the concrete. Scattered papers from her book bag littered the ground, their ink smudged by the rain. A small thermos, still warm with coffee, stood upright as if placed down only moments before. But Maggie had disappeared without a trace. Police officers arrived quickly after a concerned passerby reported the abandoned belongings. Detective Frank Delaney, a seasoned investigator, studied the scene beneath the flickering streetlight. To him, it looked like a struggle had taken place. The broken umbrella suggested force, and the scattered books hinted at sudden violence. Yet, in spite of their efforts, no footprints could be traced through the rain, and no witnesses stepped forward with a clear description. The Holloway case began that night with confusion and dread. Officers knocked on doors, asking residents what they had seen. Most had noticed nothing unusual beyond the heavy rain and the distant sound of traffic. A few mentioned the dark sedan, but details were vague. The car vanished into the storm as quickly as Maggie had. Word of the disappearance spread through Springfield by the following morning. Police blocked off the street and searched nearby alleys, fields, and wooded areas. Volunteers joined the effort, combing through ditches and farmland in the biting autumn cold. Helicopters circled overhead, and divers searched a nearby river. But every effort ended the same way, empty-handed. Within 24 hours, Maggie Holloway's disappearance dominated the headlines of local newspapers. A young woman, educated, well-liked, with no reason to run away, had vanished in the heart of Springfield. Reporters described her as a model student, someone with a future full of promise. To the community, the case was more than a mystery. It was a nightmare that unfolded in their own backyard. Detective Delaney reviewed the first pieces of evidence: the broken umbrella, the scattered papers, the thermos. None offered a clear lead. Forensic science in 1967 was limited. There were no DNA tests, no advanced databases, no surveillance cameras watching the streets. What investigators had was only instinct, interviews, and the faint hope that someone, somewhere, had noticed a detail that could unlock the truth. Days turned into weeks, and the questions deepened. Who had taken Maggie? Why was she targeted? And how could a young woman vanish in such a populated part of town without anyone seeing the full act unfold? Behind the unanswered questions, a chilling thought lingered. Someone had watched Maggie leave the library. Someone had chosen that moment, on that rainy October night, to take her. And that someone was still out there, hidden within the community, living as if nothing had happened. The scene at the bus stop remained etched in the memories of investigators. The twisted umbrella, the scattered books, the still warm thermos, all silent witnesses to a crime that no one could yet solve. To Maggie's family, those items became unbearable symbols of absence. To detectives, they were the only fragile threads of a puzzle that seemed impossible to complete. For Springfield, the Holloway disappearance was more than a police case. It was a shattering of trust, the sudden reminder that danger could strike even in the most ordinary places. Parents warned their children not to walk alone at night. College students traveled in pairs. Fear lingered long after the rain had dried from the pavement. What began as a missing person report soon grew into one of the most haunting mysteries in Illinois history. For 56 years, the Holloway case remained unsolved, locked in silence and shadow. And yet, even as decades passed, the truth did not vanish. It waited, buried beneath layers of time, evidence, and secrets, until the day it finally came to light. But on that stormy October evening in 1967, no one could imagine the decades of heartbreak, suspicion, and unanswered questions that would follow. The bus stop stood empty. The rain washed away the footprints, and Maggie Holloway was gone. Before the night of October 12, 1967, before the broken umbrella and the scattered books, there was Margaret Maggie Holloway, a young woman with a life full of hope. Maggie was born and raised in Springfield, Illinois, in a modest neighborhood where families knew each other by name and children played on sidewalks until the streetlights came on. Her father, Robert Holloway, worked long shifts at a local auto parts factory. Her mother, Helen Holloway, stayed home, caring for Maggie and her younger brother, David. The Holloways did not have much money, but they had something else: closeness. Their family bond was strong, built on evening dinners together and quiet routines that gave comfort in uncertain times. Maggie stood out early in life. Teachers described her as curious and eager, always reaching for more books than her classmates. She had a gift for learning, but also for kindness. She helped younger children with their schoolwork, often volunteering her afternoons to read aloud at the local community center. Those who knew her best said she had the ability to make anyone feel seen, whether it was a neighbor, a classmate, or even a stranger at the grocery store. By 1967, Maggie was 22 years old and attending Springfield College. She was pursuing a degree in education, with the dream of becoming an elementary school teacher. She wanted to inspire children, to give them the same love of learning she had carried since childhood. Her notebooks were filled not only with lecture notes, but also with sketches of classroom ideas, lesson plans, and even motivational quotes she hoped to share with her future students. Her younger brother David, who was still in high school at the time, admired her deeply. To him, Maggie was more than a sister. She was a role model. She encouraged him to study hard, stay out of trouble, and believe in himself. David later recalled how she never missed one of his school events, always cheering louder than anyone else in the crowd. Maggie's friend described her as the light of every room. She had an easy laugh and a warm spirit that made people gravitate toward her. She was not the kind of person who chased popularity, yet she carried a quiet charisma that drew people in. Her dorm mates remembered evenings when she would sit by the window with her books open, often to quiz them before exams, while still finding a way to joke and ease their nerves. Outside of academics, Maggie had a simple but joyful life. She loved music, often listening to vinyl records in her room late into the evening. She enjoyed walking to the city park, especially in the fall when the leaves turned gold and the air grew crisp. She kept a small journal where she wrote about her dreams and reflections. In one entry, just weeks before her disappearance, she wrote that she wanted to live a life that mattered, a life where she could give something back to others. Her family believed she was destined for great things. Helen often told friends how proud she was of her daughter, how Maggie was the first in the family to attend college, and how she seemed determined to carve out a better future. Robert, though less expressive, quietly showed his pride by saving part of his wages to support Maggie's studies. For a family of modest means, Maggie's education represented more than personal success. It represented hope. And then there was Maggie's gentle heart. She could not walk past a stray animal without stopping to help. She wrote letters to friends who felt lonely and left encouraging notes for classmates who struggled. To many, she seemed like someone untouched by the harshness of the world, someone who believed in kindness even when others did not. That was the Maggie the town of Springfield knew, the bright, intelligent young woman with her whole life ahead of her, which is why her disappearance hit so deeply. The idea that someone like her, someone with such promise and goodness, could vanish without explanation was unbearable for those who loved her. As the search for Maggie began, her journals, her books, and her small personal belongings became symbols of a life interrupted. Each item carried the weight of what might have been. Every memory of her laughter, every echo of her plans for future, became painful reminders of what was stolen on that October night. For her family, especially young David, the loss was more than a mystery. It was a wound that would never fully heal. For her community, it was a tragedy that turned their sense of safety upside down. And for investigators, it was the beginning of a haunting question. How could a young woman with so much life ahead simply vanish into the rain? The story of Maggie Holloway was no longer just a story of a promising college student. It became the story of a life interrupted, a dream broken, and a family left in darkness. And as detectives pressed forward in those early days, the focus shifted from who Maggie was to what happened to her in those crucial moments after she left the library. The search for answers was only just beginning. The rain had not stopped by the time Margaret Maggie Holloway left the Springfield Public Library on October 12, 1967. The clock inside the building read 9:15 p.m. as she stepped onto the wet pavement. She held her books tightly to her chest, her umbrella shielding her from the storm. The streets were quiet, the lamps glowing faintly against the drizzle, their reflections stretching across the slick sidewalks. Maggie's destination was a bus stop 2 blocks away, a familiar route she had walked countless times before. But this night would not be like the others. Several witnesses later recalled details that seemed ordinary at first, but grew sinister in hindsight. One man walking home from work noticed a dark-colored sedan parked near the streetlights. Its engine was running quietly, the wipers sliding back and forth across the windshield. The man assumed it belonged to a resident and walked on. Another witness, a teenage girl leaving a corner store, remembered the shape of the car, but not the license plate. She described it as waiting, like it had been sitting there for some time. Maggie passed the vehicle as she walked toward the bus stop. Whether she noticed it or not remains unknown. At 9:20 p.m., a chilling sound pierced the storm. Clara Jensen, who lived in an apartment overlooking the street, heard a sharp scream. She rushed to her window and peered out, but the rain and mist blurred her view. She saw only the deserted sidewalk and the faint shadow of a car pulling away. Within moments, the sound of the engine was gone. Clara hesitated, unsure if what she had heard was real or just the wind carrying through the storm. Minutes later, the bus arrived at the stop. The driver expected to see Maggie. She was a regular passenger, but the bench was empty. Instead, scattered across the concrete were her belongings: a broken umbrella, its metal frame twisted and bent, a small stack of books, their pages smudged and torn by the rain, a thermos of coffee, still warm to the touch, standing upright as though it had been placed down only moments earlier. But Maggie herself had vanished. At 9:35 p.m., a passerby reported the scene to the police. Within minutes, officers arrived, their flashlights cutting through the rain. Detective Frank Delaney, one of Springfield's most experienced investigators, crouched beside the umbrella. He studied the scattered papers and the upright thermos. To him, it looked like a struggle had taken place. The items had not been abandoned carefully. They had been dropped in chaos. The first question was immediate. Had Maggie walked away by choice, or had she been taken? At first, police considered the possibility of a voluntary disappearance. Young adults sometimes left without notice, chasing freedom or running from stress. But those who knew Maggie quickly dismissed the idea. She had no reason to vanish. She had exams scheduled, family waiting at home, and a future she was determined to build. Running away did not match who she was. By midnight, the situation grew urgent. Officers knocked on doors, asking residents what they had seen or heard. Most reported nothing unusual, except for the faint memory of the dark sedan. Others mentioned the scream, though none could describe the source. Rain had already washed away any footprints, leaving the investigators with little to work with. Back at the Holloway home, the knock on the door came just after 1 a.m. Robert and Helen Holloway answered to find 2 officers standing grimly in the rain. They were told that Maggie was missing, her belongings found abandoned at the bus stop. Helen collapsed into tears on the front porch, while Robert tried to remain composed. In that moment, their quiet world shattered. The first hours of the search moved with dramatic urgency. Officers widened their search perimeter, sweeping through alleys, fields, and wooded areas with flashlights. Volunteers joined, their boots sinking into the muddy ground as they called Maggie's name into the night. Divers searched the nearby river, fearing she may have been forced into the water. Helicopters circled overhead, their spotlights cutting through the darkness. But despite the scale of the search, the results were the same. No trace of Maggie. The Holloway family waited in agony as detectives came and went. David, only 16 years old, sat awake through the night, staring at the front door, hoping his sister would walk in. Each hour that passed made it clearer. Something terrible had happened. By dawn, the case had already shifted from missing person to suspected abduction. Detective Delaney briefed his team, describing the scene as disturbingly deliberate. The broken umbrella, the scattered books, the thermos. They painted a picture of someone interrupted mid-step, someone taken against their will. The Springfield police faced their first obstacle. No clear suspect. The dark sedan was their only lead, but no one had noted its plate number, and the description was vague. Without forensic tools, they could not recover prints from wet items or trace fibers from clothing. They were chasing shadows in the rain. As the sun rose over Springfield on October 13th, the Holloway case dominated local headlines. Reporters gathered near the library and the bus stop, documenting every move of the search. For the community, it was more than a mystery. It was a chilling reminder that danger could strike in familiar places. For the Holloway family, it was the beginning of a nightmare. Every detail of the night, the scream, the broken umbrella, the empty bench, became unbearable symbols of uncertainty. Maggie had vanished into the storm, leaving behind only fragments of her last moments. And as the hours turned into days, the mystery of what had happened to her deepened. The first phase of the investigation was underway, and detectives knew the clock was ticking. What they did not know was that this case would not be solved for 56 long years. The disappearance of Margaret Maggie Holloway shook Springfield to its core. By the morning after she vanished, the quiet Midwestern city was alive with fear, whispers, and suspicion. Springfield police wasted no time in mobilizing their resources. Detectives Frank Delaney and Walter Green, both seasoned officers in their 40s, were assigned to lead the case. They carried years of experience, but even they sensed immediately that this investigation would test the limits of their abilities. From the start, the detectives took a traditional approach. They canvassed the streets surrounding the bus stop, moving door to door, searching for anyone who might have seen something that night. Each knock brought new fragments of information, some useful, others only adding to the confusion. Several neighbors remembered hearing a scream near 9:30 p.m., while a passerby recalled a dark sedan idling near the library. The details lined up imperfectly, like puzzle pieces forced together. The officers also interviewed bus drivers who worked the late-night route. One insisted he saw a young woman at the corner bench, clutching books beneath her arm, just before rain intensified. Another swore the bench had been empty by the time his bus pulled up. Those contradictions troubled Delaney and Green. They knew that timing was everything in cases like this, and already the timeline was slipping through their hands. Attention soon turned to residents who lived closest to the bus stop. Among them was Earl Donovan, a local mechanic with a checker reputation. Earl was no stranger to police files. Over the years, women had lodged complaints about his unsettling behavior, unwanted advances, inappropriate comments, and lingering outside the library after dark. Though none of those incidents had escalated to violence, his name quickly rose to the top of the suspect list. Donovan lived in a small rented house less than 2 blocks from where Maggie was last seen. Detectives visited him within 48 hours. He answered the door with grease-stained hands and a defensive tone. Yes, he admitted, he had been working late in his garage that evening. No, he claimed, he had not seen or heard anything unusual. When pressed, he insisted he barely knew Maggie. Still, the detectives felt unease. The man's history painted him in a troubling light, but the evidence simply was not there. Witness accounts deepened the mystery rather than clarified it. Some claimed the dark sedan had been parked for nearly an hour. Others swore it pulled away moments after the scream. Without cameras on the streets and with no scientific tools beyond fingerprints and photographs, investigators were left relying on memory, and memory they knew could be as fragile as a broken umbrella left on the sidewalk. Rumors spread quickly through the community. Parents warned daughters not to walk alone at night. Coffee shop conversations speculated that Maggie had been taken by a stranger passing through town. Others whispered darker theories, that perhaps she had known her abductor, that trust itself had been her undoing. Each theory reached the Holloway family, amplifying their grief with unbearable questions. Detectives Delaney and Green poured themselves into the case, Reviewing each lead, revisiting the bus stop at night to imagine how events might have unfolded, they searched nearby fields, combed wooded trails, and dragged a small creek for any sign of her. Every effort ended the same way: silence, emptiness, and no trace of Maggie. The limitations of the era became painfully clear. In 1967, DNA analysis was science fiction. Surveillance was non-existent. Even the most basic evidence, a broken umbrella, scattered papers, a still warm thermos, could not tell them what they desperately needed to know: who had taken Maggie and why. As weeks passed, tips slowed. Hope began to fade. Detective Green later admitted in a private report, "We feel as though we are chasing shadows." Families in Springfield kept their children close, while the Holloways lived in torment, clinging to belief that someone, somewhere, had to know the truth. By the end of that first month, the early investigation had hit a wall. Donovan remained a person of interest, but not a charged suspect. The leads grew colder with each passing day. For the detectives, it was the most haunting kind of case, one with fragments of answers but no clear path forward. And yet, even as official files began to thin, whispers continued. Whispers of the dark sedan. Whispers of a scream that still echoed in the minds of neighbors. Whispers of secrets Springfield was not ready to confront. The case, though stalled, was far from closed. For beneath the surface of those quiet Midwestern streets, the truth still lingered, waiting to be uncovered in the years to come. The disappearance of Margaret Maggie Holloway did not remain a private tragedy for long. Within days, it became headline news across Illinois. Newspapers carried her photograph on their front pages, a smiling young woman in her college sweater, books in hand, eyes bright with possibility. Beneath the picture, bold letters asked a haunting question: where is Maggie? For the Holloway family, every word printed was a painful reminder of the nightmare they were living. Maggie's parents, Thomas and Eleanor, stood before cameras, voices trembling as they pleaded for their daughter's safe return. "She is our light," Eleanor said, tears streaming down her face. "Please, if anyone knows where she is, help us bring her home." Those images burned into the memory of the community, drawing sympathy, anger, and fear in equal measure. Maggie's younger brother, David, only 17 at the time, struggled most of all. He had always admired his sister, following her through the hallways of their neighborhood and clinging to her encouragement. When she vanished, his world collapsed. He stopped attending social events, retreated from friends, and carried a quiet guilt that he could not explain. To him, she had been both protector and guide, and without her, the world suddenly felt unsafe. Her classmates at the local college responded with sorrow and solidarity. Within a week, they organized a candlelight vigil outside the Springfield Public Library, the last place Maggie had been seen. Hundreds gathered, holding candles that flickered in the autumn wind, their prayers rising into the night sky. Friends described her as the light of every room, and vowed not to let her memory fade, even if the investigation brought no answers. The town itself was never the same. Springfield, once considered a safe and predictable Midwestern city, became a place of unease. Parents warned daughters not to walk home alone after dark. Bus stops that once symbolized routine now carried a shadow of fear. Women began traveling in groups, glancing over shoulders, sensing danger in every parked car. A single disappearance had broken the illusion of safety, replacing comfort with suspicion. Rumors spread quickly, fueled by fear. Some whispered about the mysterious dark sedan. Others wondered if Maggie had been taken by someone close to her, a person who had hidden in plain sight. These whispers grew louder in diners, churches, and classrooms. Springfield was no longer united only by traditions. It was now bound by uncertainty and grief. For the Holloways, life became a relentless cycle of hope and despair. Each ring of the phone carried both promise and dread. Each letter in the mailbox was opened with shaking hands, only to reveal bills, advertisements, or empty words of sympathy. There was no message from Maggie, no ransom note, no clue that offered the family even a small measure of peace. Nights stretched endlessly, Eleanor awake by the window, Thomas pacing the living room, David staring at his sister's empty chair. As months turned into years, Maggie's absence became an open wound that never closed. Birthdays passed with missing place at the table. Holidays carried an unspoken ache. Her room was left untouched, a shrine to the life that had been stolen. Neighbors who once stopped by with casseroles eventually stopped knocking, but the Holloways never stopped waiting. Springfield carried the weight of the case as well. Every new headline about missing women in Illinois reopened the wound. The memory of Maggie's face on those front pages lingered in every home. What had started as a single family's nightmare had grown into a collective trauma. One disappearance had left scars that would last for decades. Scars on a family that had lost its brightest star, and on a town that would never again believe it was safe in the shadows of the night. The early momentum in Maggie Holloway's case soon gave way to years of frustration. For every promising lead that surfaced, disappointment followed close behind. Each new name, each whispered rumor, seemed to pull investigators closer to the truth, only to vanish like smoke. In late 1967, a drifter passing through Illinois caught police attention. He had been seen hitchhiking near Springfield around the time of Maggie's disappearance. His record stained with petty theft and disorderly conduct. Detectives brought him in, interrogating him for hours under the harsh glow of the station lights. For a brief moment, it felt like the case had cracked open. Yet when his alibi checked out, he had been in a neighboring town that night. He was released. The Holloway family's fragile hope was crushed again. Then came Richard Caldwell, a quiet but troubled classmate of Maggie's. Investigators discovered a series of letters he had written to her, pages filled with adoration, obsession, and promises that bordered on delusion. Some were found among Maggie's belongings, others tucked into library books she borrowed. To detectives, Caldwell seemed like the kind of man who could blur admiration into possession. They questioned him extensively, searching his dormitory, hoping for a breakthrough. But once again, the evidence fell short. There was no trace of Maggie, no link tying him to that October night. Caldwell was released, and though suspicion lingered in the minds of some, the case stalled once more. As the years wore on, the Holloways endured a cruel pattern. Each time a suspect emerged, their spirits lifted ever so slightly, only to crash when the truth unraveled. It was a cycle of rising hope and bitter disappointment. Eleanor Holloway once described it as living in a room where the door keeps opening, but no one ever walks in. Detectives Frank Delaney and Walter Green, who had first led the search, fought against the erosion of leads. They spent countless hours revisiting statements, knocking on doors that had been opened years earlier, and scanning through files that offered no new light. But Springfield was changing. Resources dwindled, attention shifted. And with every year that passed, the case slipped further from the front page. By the mid-1970s, other names surfaced. Men arrested in neighboring towns. Suspects in unrelated crimes who seemed to fit the shadowy outlines of Maggie's last night. Each time, Springfield police made the calls, traveled the miles, and followed the trail. Each time, the result was the same. Another dead end. Inside the Holloway home, the toll was heavy. Thomas aged beyond his years. The lines on his face etched deeper with each unanswered question. Eleanor clung to Maggie's belongings as though they could whisper the truth. And David grew into adulthood carrying the silent weight of loss, watching detectives chase shadows that never led anywhere. By the 1980s, Delaney and Green had retired. New officers inherited the case, but the passion of those first investigators seemed dimmed by the sheer volume of unsolved crimes. Maggie's file grew thicker with reports, but thinner with hope. It was stored in the back of filing cabinets, pulled out only when a new rumor forced it into the light again. The community, too, began to move forward, though the scar remained. New families settled in Springfield. Children grew. Buildings changed. But for those who had lived through 1967, the name Margaret Holloway was a wound that never healed. They spoke of her in whispers, her face fading from memory except in the hearts of those who had loved her. The truth seemed buried beneath the passing years, hidden in plain sight, just beyond the reach of every effort. The Holloways waited. The town waited. And all the while, the shadows held their silence, guarding the secret of what truly happened on that autumn night. By the late 1970s, the Holloway investigation had run dry. Detectives who had once pounded the pavement, chasing every rumor and every shadow, now admitted the painful truth. There were no new leads, no new witnesses, no evidence that could push the case forward. The Springfield Police Department officially classified the disappearance of Margaret Maggie Holloway as a cold case. For the Holloway family, the decision was a devastating blow. To them, Maggie was not a file in a cabinet or a headline fading from memory. She was a daughter, a sister, a young woman whose smile still lived in every photograph framed in their home. But as the years rolled on, that home grew quieter. Thomas Holloway passed away in 1979, never knowing what happened to his eldest child. His wife, Eleanor, followed just a few years later, her heart worn down by decades of unanswered questions. Their son, David, carried the burden into adulthood. What had once been the laughter of a younger brother waiting at the window for his sister's return had hardened into the resolve of a man determined to keep her name alive. Yet, despite his efforts, he often felt like he was shouting into silence. Every letter he sent to the police department, every request for updates, was met with the same answer: there is nothing new. As Springfield moved into the 1980s and 1990s, the town itself seemed to leave the Holloway tragedy behind. New families moved in, new stories filled the newspapers, and the memory of Maggie's disappearance became a quiet whisper in the community. For the older residents who remember the fear of 1967, the bus stop remained a haunting landmark, but for many, it was just another corner of the city. Meanwhile, advances in forensic science were beginning to transform criminal investigations. DNA profiling, computerized fingerprint databases, and new forensic tools promised breakthroughs in cases once thought impossible to solve. But Maggie's file sat untouched, buried in storage boxes at the back of a records room. Dust collected on the folders, and the once urgent notes of detectives Frank Delaney and Walter Green yellowed with age. The silence stretched into decades. David Holloway married, raised children of his own, and tried to give them a sense of normalcy. Yet Maggie's shadow was always there, a presence woven into family life. Her nieces and nephews never met her, but they grew up hearing stories of Aunt Maggie, told in soft voices, usually while staring at faded photographs. To them, she was both real and unreal, an eternal 22-year-old whose dreams had been stolen long before they were born. The cost of waiting was devastating, not just for the Holloways, but for the generations who inherited the pain. Each passing year deepened the mystery and widened the distance between the living and the truth. The town may have moved on, but the family never did. They carried the silence like a second skin, a reminder that justice delayed was not only justice denied. It was a wound passed from one generation to the next. By the dawn of the new millennium, Maggie's disappearance had become a ghost story of Springfield, a story that seemed destined to remain unsolved. Yet, beneath the weight of dust and silence, the truth was still there, waiting to be uncovered. And one day, decades later, it would finally rise to the surface. For more than half a century, the name Margaret Maggie Holloway had lingered in Springfield as a haunting memory. Her case seemed destined to remain unsolved, another tragedy swallowed by time. But in 2023, the silence was finally broken. Detective Amy Rodriguez, a determined investigator with the Springfield Police Department's cold case unit, was known for her persistence. Younger officers admired her refusal to let forgotten files stay buried. While others saw stacks of paper and dust, she saw unfinished stories. When she pulled the Holloway file from storage, its worn folders and faded photographs carried the weight of 56 years of unanswered questions. Rodriguez spread the evidence across her desk. Maggie's smiling college portrait, the original missing person posters, witness statements written in fading typewriter ink. But it was the physical evidence that drew her attention. The broken umbrella, scraps of clothing, a thermos that had once carried warm coffee. All had been sealed and stored for decades. In 1967, they had offered little more than tragic artifacts. But in 2023, with modern forensic science, they represented something far more powerful, the possibility of truth. Rodriguez contacted the State Forensic Laboratory and requested new testing on every item preserved. It was a long process, requiring careful handling of evidence that had aged more than half a century. Weeks stretched into months as technicians worked, extracting what little biological material they could still find. For Rodriguez, Every day of waiting carried the pulse of suspense. She knew the risk. The evidence might be too degraded, the results inconclusive, but deep down, she believed Maggie's story deserved one final chance. Then, in the summer of 2023, the call came. Technicians had recovered a partial male DNA profile from fibers on Maggie's clothing and from the handle of the broken umbrella. When pieced together, the samples formed a clear genetic signature, one that belonged to no one in the original investigation. The discovery was astonishing. For decades, suspects have been questioned, dismissed, or cleared, but none of them carried this DNA. When Rodriguez submitted the profile into CODIS, the National Forensic Database, the system processed the entry in seconds before flashing a message she had only dreamed of seeing. Match found. The name on the screen was Thomas Whitaker, age 78, living quietly in Decatur, Illinois, just under an hour from Springfield. Whitaker was not a career criminal. He had no record of violent convictions. On paper, he appeared ordinary, a retired postal worker, a widower, and grandfather. But his file carried one striking detail. In 1967, just days after Maggie's disappearance, he had been questioned briefly by police as a witness. At the time, Whitaker had lived a few blocks from the bus stop where Maggie vanished. He told investigators he had been walking home that night, saw nothing unusual, and went on his way. With no evidence against him, police moved on. His name faded into the background of the case, filed under statements given. Now, 56 years later, the forensic evidence pointed directly back to him. For Rodriguez, the revelation was both thrilling and chilling. The suspect had been there all along, hiding in plain sight. He had lived out an entire life, working, raising a family, attending community gatherings, while Maggie's loved ones endured decades of silence. News of the breakthrough spread quickly through the department. Officers who had never heard of the Holloway case before suddenly found themselves drawn into the story. For some of the older residents of Springfield, the announcement reopened wounds they thought had scarred over. "I remember that night," one neighbor said quietly. "We all thought it would never be solved. Now to hear there is a name, it is unbelievable." For David Holloway, now in his 70s, the development was overwhelming. He had spent his entire adult life chasing answers, carrying the burden his parents had never lived to see resolved. When Rodriguez informed of the DNA match, his hands trembled. After decades of dead ends, there was finally a name, a man who walked the same streets as his sister and carried the secret of her fate for more than half a century. The case was no longer a story of silence and loss. It had become a story of science, persistence, and a shocking twist no one had expected. The match to Thomas Whitaker reignited not only the Holloway investigation, but the attention of an entire community. Newspapers once again carried Maggie's photograph, this time alongside the face of an elderly man who had lived unnoticed among them for decades. Springfield, Illinois, was bracing itself for answers at last. But what those answers would reveal, what Thomas Whitaker might confess or deny, remained the darkest mystery still to come. For Detective Amy Rodriguez, the Holloway file no longer felt like just another cold case. It had become something deeper, an unfinished story that demanded her full attention. From the moment the DNA match identified Thomas Whitaker, she felt a responsibility not only to Maggie, but also to the generations of Holloways who had waited in vain for justice. Day after day, Rodriguez at her desk surrounded by stacks of documents, photographs, and yellowed reports. The details of Whitaker's life slowly unfolded before her, painting a far darker portrait than his quiet retirement suggested. In 1967, Whitaker had been employed at a maintenance job not far from the Springfield Public Library, the very place Maggie had spent her final evening. His work hours ended just before the library closed, placing him in the vicinity at the exact time she vanished. In the original files, this fact had been mentioned but never pursued, lost among dozens of leads. Rodriguez dug deeper, combing through employment records, archive complaints, and faded police notes. What she found unsettled her. In the months before Maggie's disappearance, 2 young women had reported being followed by a man matching Whitaker's description. Another woman, a co-worker at his job, recalled him making unwanted advances that escalated into harassment. None of these incidents had led to criminal charges. And in 1967, such complaints were often dismissed as misunderstandings. But to Rodriguez, they revealed a pattern, a man whose quiet exterior hid something far more dangerous. She revisited Whitaker's original statement, typed neatly in the files. He claimed he had been walking home the night of October 12th, saw no one, and went directly to bed. But Rodriguez noticed the inconsistencies. His timeline did not align with bus schedules. A neighbor at the time had mentioned seeing a man loitering near the bus stop. But that detail was buried in the files, dismissed when nothing connected it to a suspect. Piece by piece, the story Whitaker had told decades earlier began to unravel. Rodriguez's investigation stretched beyond dusty archives. She followed Whitaker's trail through the decades, examining where he had lived, who he had married, and how he had carried himself in the community. What emerged was a life marked by control and secrecy. His wife, who had passed away years earlier, was remembered by neighbors as timid and withdrawn. Former colleagues described him as strict and difficult, a man who kept others at a distance. The more Rodriguez uncovered, the more the weight of Maggie's story pressed on her. At night, long after her shift ended, she found herself rereading Maggie's letters to friends, the ones preserved by her family. She studied photographs of the young woman with bright eyes and boundless hope, imagining the life she should have lived. Rodriguez felt a connection not only to the victim but to David Holloway, who had carried a burden of unanswered questions for more than 5 decades. It was not just professional duty that kept Rodriguez working. It was personal conviction. She believed the truth had been hidden for too long, and she refused to let Maggie's memory remain buried beneath silence. Every inconsistency in Whitaker's past, every overlooked note in the file, felt like a key to unlocking the truth. By autumn of 2023, Rodriguez had built a detailed profile of Whitaker's life. He was no longer just a name on a DNA report. He was a man whose presence near the crime scene, history of harassment, and carefully hidden secrets pointed to something much darker than coincidence. For Rodriguez, the case had become more than an investigation. It was a vow. She would not allow Maggie Holloway to be forgotten, and she would not let Whitaker's secrets remain unchallenged. The time for silence had ended. What remained was the most difficult step of all, confronting Thomas Whitaker face to face. The interrogation room was quiet, the kind of silence that carried more weight than words. Thomas Whitaker, now 78 years old, sat hunched over the metal table. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, at least not yet, but from age. His once sharp features had dulled, softened by time, but his eyes still carried a guarded calculation. Detective Amy Rodriguez sat across from him, the case file spread open like a carefully set trap. She knew this was not just another interview. This was the moment 56 years in the making. "Thomas," she began calmly, her voice steady but piercing, "we have tested the evidence from 1967. Your DNA is on Maggie Holloway's clothing. It's not speculation. It's science. Do you want to tell me how that happened?" Whitaker's lips tightened. He shook his head slowly, his voice rasping with age. "I do not know what you are talking about. I never hurt that girl." Rodriguez did not flinch. She leaned forward, sliding a photograph across the table. Maggie's smiling face frozen in time. "This young woman has waited 56 years for the truth. Her family died without answers. Do not let this lie be your final legacy." For nearly an hour, Whitaker deflected. He claimed the police must have contaminated the evidence. He insisted he had only passed Maggie on the street once or twice. But with every denial, Rodriguez pressed harder, weaving inconsistencies in his story against the cold, unyielding facts. Then came the breaking point. Rodriguez produced a DNA match report, laying it in front of him. "This does not lie," she said firmly. "You were there. You touched her. Tell me what you did." Whitaker's shoulders slumped. The fight in him began to drain away. His breathing grew shallow, his hands fidgeting as if searching for a way out that no longer existed. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "I did not mean for it to go that far." Rodriguez's eyes narrowed. "Tell me." The confession came haltingly at first, like a dam cracking under pressure. Then the flood poured out. He admitted that he had noticed Maggie weeks before she disappeared. She walked past the library almost every evening, books tucked under her arm, a smile that lingered even in the autumn chill. To Whitaker, she became an obsession. He followed her from a distance, learning her routines, convincing himself that one day she might notice him. On the night of October 12, 1967, he waited outside the library. When Maggie left, umbrella in hand, he offered her a ride. She refused politely at first, but when the rain came down harder, she reluctantly accepted. What began as an offer of shelter turned sinister. Whitaker drove past her street, ignoring her pleas to stop. When she realized his intentions, Maggie fought back. She scratched, screamed, and tried to open the door, but Whitaker lashed out in rage. He struck her, silencing her cries. Tears welled in his eyes as he recalled the moment. She would not stop fighting, he muttered. I panicked. I did not mean to kill her, but when I looked down, she was gone. The room grew heavier with every word. Whitaker then described driving to an abandoned farmhouse outside Springfield. Under the cover of darkness, he dragged Maggie's lifeless body to a shallow pit near the barn and covered her with soil and debris. He kept her belongings, discarding some later, but the umbrella, snapped in the struggle, was tossed aside, where investigators would one day recover it. The chilling detail that haunted Rodriguez most was his motive. Whitaker confessed that his obsession with Maggie stemmed from rejection. She smiled at everyone, he said bitterly, but she never looked at me. I wanted her to notice me, to know I was there. When she resisted, it felt like rage took over. With his words, 56 years of silence shattered. The truth, long buried beneath lies and secrecy, was finally laid bare. Following his confession, investigators accompanied Whitaker to the farmhouse site. Even after decades, the soil preserved fragments of Maggie's remains. The recovery was painstaking, emotional, and devastating. Forensic teams confirmed the identity through dental records, closing the Holloway family's unanswered chapter at last. As Whitaker was led back into custody, Detective Rodriguez watched him carefully. There was no satisfaction in the moment, no triumph. Only the grim knowledge that justice, though delayed, had finally arrived. Maggie Holloway's story was no longer an unsolved mystery. It was now a tale of obsession, violence, and the perseverance of those who refused to let her memory fade. And for the first time in 56 years, Springfield could finally speak her name with truth, not silence. The morning Thomas Whitaker was arrested, Springfield woke to an image that seemed impossible. Police cruisers lined the quiet suburban street, their flashing lights casting red and blue against rows of tidy homes. Neighbors peered from behind curtains and front porches, stunned to see officers escorting a frail 78-year-old man in handcuffs. For decades, Whitaker had blended into the rhythm of the town. To most, he was a quiet retiree who tended his garden, waved politely at the mail carrier, and attended church on Sundays. Few would have suspected that this man had harbored one of the darkest secrets in Illinois history. The news spread like wildfire. Parents whispered at school drop-offs, and grocery store conversations shifted to hushed disbelief. All these years, one neighbor said, shaking her head. He lived right here, and none of us ever knew. For David Holloway, Maggie's younger brother, the arrest was both a moment of profound relief and piercing sorrow. Now in his 70s, David had carried the weight of his sister's disappearance for most of his life. He had spoken her name in interviews, attended vigils, and written letters to police chiefs who came and went. Finally, he could face the man responsible. Yet the joy of answers came with the ache of finality. I am grateful for the truth, David told reporters, his voice breaking. But nothing will ever bring Maggie back. National headlines quickly seized on the story. News anchors spoke of a 56-year-old mystery finally solved, and a cold case cracked by modern science. The photographs of Maggie Holloway, bright and smiling, filled television screens once again. She was no longer just a name in an old file. She was a face America remembered, a life that mattered. As Whitaker appeared in court for the first time, the contrast was striking. Dressed in a beige prison jumpsuit, he shuffled into the room, his body frail, supported by a cane. Yet despite his physical weakness, the gravity of his crimes filled the courtroom like a storm cloud. Family members, community residents, and journalists packed the benches, watching as a man who had eluded justice for half a century was finally forced to answer for his actions. Prosecutors laid out the evidence with deliberate precision. The DNA matched the confession and the discovery of Maggie's remains. They emphasized not just the crime, but the decades of anguish that had followed. The defense, limited by Whitaker's own admissions, argued his age and failing health should be considered. But no legal maneuver could erase the truth. Reporters captured every detail. The tremor in Whitaker's voice when asked to confirm his identity, the solemn nod of Detective Amy Rodriguez as she testified about the DNA breakthrough, and the tears on David Holloway's face as he listened to his sister's story retold in painful detail. The community reaction was one of collective reckoning. People wrestled with the idea that Whitaker had lived among them, unremarkable yet dangerous. For some, it shattered trust in appearances. For others, it deepened respect for persistence, the determination of law enforcement, and the resilience of the Holloway family who had never given up. Outside the courthouse, a makeshift memorial of flowers and candles grew near the courthouse steps. Strangers left notes addressed to Maggie, some reading simply, "You are not forgotten." The aftermath of Whitaker's arrest was not about vengeance, but about closure. Justice had come late, but it had come nonetheless. Springfield, once haunted by the silence of unanswered questions, could finally begin to heal. And though Maggie Holloway's life ended on a dark October night in 1967, her story endured, a reminder that truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it is buried. The story of Margaret Holloway closes with a reflection that is both solemn and profound. For her parents, the answers arrived too late. But for her brother David and the generations that followed, truth finally broke through decades of silence. In Springfield, the community was forced to confront an unsettling truth, that evil can live quietly among ordinary lives, masked by routine and familiarity. Yet the case also revealed something greater. It showed how persistent science and the unwavering dedication of investigators can give a voice to victims long silenced. Maggie's life was stolen in a moment of obsession and violence, but her story endured until justice was done. The Holloway case became more than a crime. It became a lesson that justice may sleep, but it never dies, and truth, no matter how deeply buried, will always find its way back to light.